Good day, everybody. Today we're joined by Jan Olaf Probst. Sorry, my pronunciation is awful. But Jan Olaf is the Business Development Manager for DNV on container shipping. Welcome to the one-to-one interview, Jan Olaf.
Hello, Nick.
Today we're going to be talking about LNG, which is a transitional fuel, and discussing the elements of how we get from where we are today to 2030 effectively, which I think DNV has taken strong position on, backing LNG as a fuel, as a bridging fuel, particularly for deep sea shipping rather than for the coastal and shallow water shipping. Is that correct? Am I making assumptions there?
Absolutely correct, because we are saying deep sea shipping, and especially by container shipping, we are talking about long distances. If you are taking, for example, the distance over the Pacific or Asia, Europe, then you have a long trading, and therefore the fuel consumption or the amount what you need, it's quite large. And there we are believing that at present the best alternative solution for today is LNG.
Okay, so there are effectively three things that we need to talk about, and one of those is the technical issues. Later on we'll talk about the economic side of this, and then maybe a little bit about the regulatory. But the technical issues that you touched on there, we need to find a fuel which cuts carbon emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And so, if I'm correct, you're saying that the only way to do that is through LNG.
What we are saying that is right, and there is a question where your target line is. If you're going really to IMO target lines, then you're going back to 2008.
Yeah.
And then the emission reduction to 2030, it's easy already to fulfill, sometimes even on liquid methods. So you could achieve this one with LNG far more than the IMO target line. That is correctly. And there, in this regard, you were touching about the question, technical availability, LNG availability, and there we look about how it is practical. So if I would like to go on a shipyard and would like to order a ship, and say this one should get me minimum 40% reduced CO2 footprint compared, for example, to 2008, or even some companies even have a higher target. And I would like to sign the shipbuilding contract today and receive the vessel in 2 years or in 1.5 years, then LNG is one of the most suitable alternative fuels.
Okay, it's actually the only alternative fuel at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, because the first aspect is on the ship owner, he needs a reliable shipbuilding contract, and therefore the regulation is the IGF code. Yeah. And the IGF code is purely related to LNG. So that means at first he could, on a really stable position, sign a shipbuilding contract. The shipyard knows how to calculate the new building price. The ship owner knows that he could just put the signature on because he is requesting the fuel. And we as class society have our own rules and the IGF code to verify this one. And that is, of course, should be not underestimated, that you have a reliable possibility to sign a shipbuilding contract. And inside of the IGF code, there's even a little bit more. There are practicalities inside how to bunker.
Yeah.
And therefore, even ports have this kind of possibility to judge in which area bunkering of LNG could be done, under which kind of procedure, what kind of training have to be done, and so on and so on. And that means for this kind of fuel, this is given. And must be not invented, and that is, I think, something good.
So, what do you say to those? Because there are really two schools of thought in the shipping industry at the moment. There is the school of thought that you go with, LNG as a bridging fuel, as you just described, but there is also the school of thought where you go directly, rather than having a bridging fuel, you go directly to a low carbon or zero carbon fuel, and you look to stimulate the research and development of those fuels, which are already, we already know what they are. We know ammonia and methane are likely to be the deep sea fuels of the future. What do you say to those people who prefer to go directly to those kinds of fuels rather than using a bridging fuel, which may end up leaving owners with stranded assets? Should there be a carbon levy, etc.?
The first one we would love, and we would heavily support it if the fuel would be there. But whatever we are receiving as a feedback from shipping companies who are talking in this direction, talking about the companies who are producing this kind of fuel, there the prediction is that for this kind of amount for deep sea shipping, in this short time frame, we could not see that this one will be available on the market. So, and that is a little bit the chicken and egg situation. Of course, we could trigger a demand of ships and building this kind of ships. But then it's a question, what happens if this vessel will be delivered? For example, we take a 15,000 TEU vessel, has a fuel oil tank of 14,000 cubic, and he could not bunker 14,000 cubic, for example, on ammonia. What he should do then? I think then the ship owner is in a certain risk.
But certainly, from my understanding, DNV's stance is that you should have fuel flexibility in the design of your ships. Is that correct? So you have HFO and LNG available, both of which are fossil fuels. So they're not really getting us any closer to decarbonisation, are they?
No, but I think that your statement was absolutely correct, that we are saying what kind of technology we have today. And to be honest, we would be not today on the position of LNG if 10 years back, no one has started with this one. Look about this kind of LNG infrastructure. Bunker ships are there. And bunker ships are now available not only in Europe, they are available inside of Asia and so on. So that means this kind of learning out of the LNG part could be easily copied over to the next fuel. So you could have a certain learning out of this one, how to invent it and so on. And now we must say, it is possible to already arrange inside of your ship certain equipment which is practically used for LNG and then later on even for other fuels. So if your piping arrangement is correctly, if your tank is suitable for this one, then you could operate on LNG, and later on, if you have a possibility of, for example, ammonia, then it's possible to switch over. And it should be not even underestimated that there is even green LNG. So there is the possibility to produce LNG out of biomass.
Right.
And then I could use my same main engine. I could use my same equipment, my fuel oil tank, and immediately have even a greener fuel inside of my vessel. So now it's the question where the industry of production of fuels are going inside. If they are going in the direction to produce ammonia, which we should also not underestimate, this is a toxic gas. That means if you have a leakage out of your tank, this is a quite dangerous gas. It's a toxic gas, ammonia. Or if somebody is saying, why not try to produce green LNG in a huge scale? And then our statement about bridging fuel from fossil LNG to green LNG would be then, of course, something which have a good pathway. And for an industry, look about if I would be now an LNG provider and I have the possibility to produce green LNG, and I see that the whole infrastructure of bunker facilities, distribution is there, what you would invest? Do you would invest in green LNG or do you would invest in ammonia?
My understanding of green LNG is that it is extremely expensive to produce, far more expensive than, say, ammonia or methanol. Is that correct?
There I must say that you are maybe asking somebody who has not so much experience, but what we know from the industry usually, if there's a huge demand, then usually the cost rate is dropping down.
Okay.
And in this regard,
but then shouldn't we then say that could be true for methanol and ammonia? Is that not right? So shouldn't we go directly to those and say this cost is going to come down? Yes, there's a problem, but there's a problem with all of the fuels. There's not, we know that ammonia is toxic. We know that methanol can be expensive, etc., and it has its own problems. But there is a problem with LNG. What we need to solve is the problem of carbon and climate change. And the LNG is not that fuel, is it?
Yeah. So you are fully right in this one. But then coming back a little bit, what means bridging? And in this regard, auch even to consider that we are now in 2021. So if you are considering a vessel for operating on LNG, and taking, usually a large container ship has something about 20 years, slightly 22, and then usually the most person are saying then the ship goes out for scrapping. If that will be delivered in 23, we are by 43. And with LNG, and if you see this kind of down curving from the IMO line, a good design which you will order today based on LNG is be able to be below the IMO reference line. So in this regard, our statement, and that sounds of course a little bit funny, you are be able to fulfill and contribute to the IMO target already with LNG in this moment. The only question item is that you are not be able maybe to order exactly this design in 5 years again.
Right.
Because then you would run out of this kind of target line. And in this regard, our statement is bridging means you buying your time. And buying time means that the whole industry could see in which direction it will run. And why I will not say not so euphoric, but look about LNG was used at first for LNG tanker. They was allowed to use LNG, and if you look, for example, ammonia tanker, they are not allowed to run on ammonia. So that means up to now, the industry had no learning about using this kind of fuel.
Yeah.
When we were starting on LNG, we had already the learning on LNG carrier to use this one as fuel.
Yeah.
So now we have to consider, is the industry and are we all, even if we put all our effort inside of something, to be able to make a learning curve, which never have happened before, to come up with a fuel only in 3, 4, 5 years. We will do everything to contribute to this one, but sometimes you have to be a little realistic, and you are quite long in the industry, and you know how long sometimes items needs to be solved.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, we've just been through a pandemic. We've created within a year vaccines which will hopefully solve that pandemic. We're not so certain of that, but it took a year. When you have the will, when you have the stimulus in place, and you can see the end result, we could, engineers, etc., can move rather quickly, I would suggest. So should we be concentrating on putting a stimulus in place? I mean, I know that the industry have suggested a $2 a ton to create an R&D fund, a research and development fund. But the stimulus has to be a little bit more than that, doesn't it? And I'm thinking of people who suggest maybe $300 on a ton of fuel would be more of a stimulus. It would equalize the if you like, that it would bring about an equal playing field for alternative zero carbon fuels. And once you start to produce those, as you say, it gets cheaper and more cost effective, and it becomes less cost effective to go on as with business as usual. And that's the kind of stimulus, that kind of intense stimulus that you need, isn't it? Rather than having a bridging fuel and then spending money on that and then having to transfer to a different alternative fuel again, you know. And that seems to me that some people within the industry have already made that decision, and I'm kind of interested to know why DNV has not gone down that road.
There are many parts inside to be discussed. The first one is, of course, I like this kind of comparison with this kind of vaccine.
Yeah.
The main question is the industry, and that would be not only maritime, because airplanes are using fuel, whatever which kind of fuel, cars are using this one, and so on. If the whole world is willing to spend so much money as they have spent in vaccine, to spend a similar amount of money and effort to invent carbon-free fuel. And to be honest, our pathway, you know, our energy transition outlook is that we are saying we need actually carbon-free fuel. This is a key element. But sometimes a wish is something which we could have for Christmas time, and we see that we have to be realistic. We have rules, for example, now how to build a vessel for ammonia. But it's quite nice that you establish this one. But if you do not could bunker it, then it's only the half of your way. Yeah. So we must say we try to be realistic, and that is something like this one. That means not that we are closing our eyes in front of ammonia, methanol, or even it could be out going in the direction of biofuel. But when we see the data about, for example, the total production on alternative fuels, what we call it, and that's the total, for example, biofuel production would serve maritime maximum to 60% of the total demand. Yeah. And then no one would get biofuel. And if we see the methanol production, this would be sufficient for 10% of shipping of the total maritime world. 10%, it's only the total worldwide production. That means we have to bring it up to 100% only for shipping and further. And now we have to ask ourselves as a kind of technical verification organization, are we really believing that this effort will be done in the next 3 years to 10 times higher production, for example, on methanol, if you would take this one, because it's much easier. You have only to paint your tank inside. You have to, some flex do not want to have it directly on the side shell, but this is kind of fuel tank protection. Your tanks are separated, so that would be an easier way, even as ammonia. But then, do you really believe that in 3 years the production will be 10 times higher than today?
I think it doesn't have to be 3 years, does it? We're talking about a 10-year period in the transition, and we're not saying that in that transition all fuels will go, all fossil fuels will go, but that we reach 40% or 30% of the decrease. Now, from what I understand from the IMO, that's 213 million tons of fuel used. My understanding from talking to biofuel producers is that they can produce far more biofuel, but there's a cost, and the cost is much higher to produce biofuel than it is to use fossil fuels. So in order to stimulate the production of biofuel, they suggest that there is a mandate to produce or to use 1%, say, for the first year, biofuel mixed with fossil fuel, and then to increase that year by year, so that the costs are reduced and the stimulation there for the production of a biofuel. The other thing is that, and I think you're absolutely right, the level of requirement for the marine and aviation sector would be very, very high, and therefore you couldn't use biofuel as it is today in cars. So cars and trucks need to find other fuels, either electricity or hydrogen. And I think that requires a level of ambition from governments and the political side in order to make that work. And isn't that a more efficient and probably environmentally friendly route, a path to decarbonisation?
We are believing, I think, that in all kind of directions we have to contribute, and if I take it like maybe from a ship owner point of view, if I would have 10 vessels, I make just 10, no, it's not, and I know that I have some vessels still quite young. For example, they are just 5 years old and running on heavy fuel.
Yeah,
And by 5 years, my asset is too young to replace it.
yeah,
So, and then if I say, okay, I have to now exchange further 5 vessels, and I will contribute with 2 vessels already because I could order it now on LNG and contribute then already with a 40% reduction on my CO2 footprint. Then I do already something good for my fleet. And if in 4 years, I replace further 3 vessels, for example, to a much better fuel, for example, to ammonia, because it is then maybe in that time there, and this vessel are contributing then the 60% reduction, and then all my 10 vessels are in a total fleet contributing totally in line to the IMO target. I think if everyone would follow this kind of principle to say, whatever I could contribute now in CO2
yeah,
reduction, I will bring it in the table. So that would be if you're running with a big basket and you want to collect money for something, and everyone is contributing with a certain portion, then you're coming to the target line. And therefore, and that is, I think, quite often misunderstood in this way on bridging fuel to say, do what you could do now and still try to find the next step to be even better than today. But that is a question of philosophy. And
yeah.
I think that is where you could talk hundreds of hours around what is better to say, okay, I go now further 3, 4 years on liquid, on HFO, and hoping that in 3 years I be a little bit better. But then you have to consider, I think what we are doing already today, calculate over a ship life, calculate over a fleet, and then maybe over a longer prediction time. And then I think all solutions will contribute to this one.
Okay,
And
but let's so go back to your what you were saying earlier, because you were saying that you would have this fleet of LNG ships and then you would move on to a different, you would build 2 different ships. With biofuel, you don't need to change your ships. A ship can run on biofuel today, and you can put that into your tank. You don't need to have separate tanks. What you need to do is to produce 40% of the fuel that we use now as biofuel, and that is a challenge, but not necessarily impossible.
that is right, and but we have really to be honest to each other. There is nothing for free on this earth. Up to now, I have never detected something like that. And if we're going, for
I'm working
example,
on it.
exactly. But if you're looking for biofuel, this name of biofuel is such big portion.
Yeah.
And a lot of this kind of biofuel produce much higher NOx emission than heavy fuel, for example. So that means you buy something to reduce CO2, but in the same time, your NOx emission is going up heavily. So that means you pay to be CO2 neutral or better neutral, you pay a higher NOx emission. I think this is in contradiction to each other. So we have always to focus, are we be able to offer something without a disadvantage in other areas? So by biofuel, only a small portion of biofuel is fulfilling the reduced or equal NOx emission and reducing CO2. So,
but we already have the technology to get rid of NOx, don't we?
Yes, you have, but this kind of equipment would be then really big. This would run on energy. So you're coming that you have to burn more fuel to serve energy to run, for example, an SCR system to get the NOx out of this higher emission. So that is a little bit in.
But you can get rid of but you could get rid of your scrubber.
And the next one is, and that should be not underestimated, in this moment you have to come immediately with regulations, because NOx regulations are only in US in this moment, and starting from this year for keel laying in Europe. That means in the other area of the world, you could then burn biofuel in generating a higher NOx emission. So on the end of the day, you will figure out, oh, this was not a good idea. So, and this is just, if you're writing all kind of fuels down, and there are advantages and disadvantages. This is for biofuel, this is for LNG, this is even for methanol, because you have in this moment only methanol even from fossil. And you have ammonia, which I told you is toxic. And if therefore we have at first of to invent the right main engines, generator, who will burn then this one in a 100% way. And in this regard, I think we have to always be seen, is there is a second side of the coin.
Right.
And only looking on CO2, our opinion is too short thinking. We have to write actually all kind of emissions down, and in our opinion, we should look in this moment already on four. It's sulfur, it is NOx, it's CO2, and particulate matter.
But methane is not considered in the EEDI. It's not counted.
Actually, it should be recalculated as CO2 emission, because it's a greenhouse gas. So you could convert the calculation up to CO2. On the end of the day, it's a greenhouse gas. So then say CO2 equal greenhouse gas part. So
equivalent.
Yeah. And in this regard, the discussion is sometimes only to focus that somebody is only looking on CO2. And in this regard, we are one step ahead, that we're saying, please look about all emissions and down by one reduction, but increasing another one.
Is there an argument to be made for alternative technologies such as wind power and carbon capture and storage, rather than finding other alternatives rather than going to another fossil fuel? In your opinion?
Yeah, and then I think when we were starting to outline what we want to do, you were saying in the beginning, deep shipping. Of course, you could say if I go over the Pacific, then I would have a certain current and I would have good wind. Then the question is where I could install on a large of container vessel a good wind sail equipment, and then I will find, okay, then I have to take the cargo away, and then I could maybe install something. If you would see it for different ship types where you have a flat deck area, there maybe definitely wind could be a kind of assistance tool. And we are collecting AES data. We look a lot of this one, and there you could definitely detect that especially container ships over the Pacific are using kind of root assistance for current, wind, so that they are making certain shapes over the in their trading part to reduce the fuel consumption.
Right.
Wind then you will reduce cargo on the vessel, and then it's a question how many more vessels you will employ, and then wind is already not like switch it on, switch it off. It is there or not. Up to now we could not. So in this regard, wind, yes, as an assistant, especially for ship types with a flat deck area where you could install equipment like flat rotor or sky estates. We do not want to promote anyone, but that all this kind of ID, which you could have seen or fixed installed field, audible, I think it's all great to do this one, but it's assisting only you. So on the end of the day, wind, in our opinion, is be used on wind parks to produce electrical energy, and with the electrical energy, you could produce then synthetic fuel.
Right.
There, in our opinion, wind is a key element in assisting shipping by producing synthetic fuel, because you was talking about cost.
Yeah.
Production on synthetic fuel needs energy, a high energy, and this could be then produced by wind. So there we would see wind as a key element in this regard, and we see auch this kind of timeline of IMO, carbon neutral fuel. That is the key element. Have emission-free fuel, and there we see wind as a key element, definitely.
And what
Carbon
about
capture is a
carbon capture
different
and
story.
storage? Is it? Go on.
Yeah, but what are you believing in this carbon capture? That because that is not really related to shipping itself.
Well, at the moment, I think what I understand is that if you were to capture the carbon from the exhaust of a ship at this moment, eventually you'd sink it because there would be so much carbon and other material for capturing. It would just be too heavy, and the storage would be enormous. But I also understand that there are new technologies arriving where the carbon capture and storage systems are more advanced, and you don't necessarily need to store the carbon on board. I'm not sure whether you've heard of these techniques.
Yeah, we heard about this kind of technique. There, my personal and I guess of our company philosophy behind is we should avoid to produce it, because storage quite often means I put it to the side and then I'm hoping that in a certain time I know what I have to do with this one. So
Right.
actually what you are doing is you're handing something over to your next generation. And actually what happened outside? The young generation is making pressure on the older generation, please do already now something, reduce CO2 emission. And now to say, okay, I reduce my CO2 emission, then I put it in a package and put it then even to you, and then later on this one you have.
But that's buying time, isn't it?
Yeah, but then it's a question, if we're talking about buying time, why not reducing the CO2 emission, for example, by 40%? Then that is just better not to produce it. That is our philosophy. So storage means only you postpone a problem. So and we are more on the opinion, don't generate it. The best
So are
one
you
is
suggesting that we should ship fewer things? Is that what you're saying?
actually, yes, and we are believing that, and we could see clearly a trend to this one, learning from each other, and we could see that some companies who are going maybe now in one direction, that they was really open in the public and was saying we will share our experience, we will share it between amongst. And then we could learn out of this one. And what I mentioned to you was this kind of how bunker facilities have been now built up for LNG, and talking with ports where I'm allowed to bunker, for example, on this pier side, yes or no, because on a container terminal you have a lot of dangerous cargo on the side, and therefore you should not bunker then LNG in that area. All this kind of learning we could immediately use maybe for another fuel which is coming. for example, this kind of ammonia, which is toxic, which is then even more critical to bunkers than LNG, we could take this learning immediately and copy it over.
Right.
And I guess that even main engine manufacturer, they are not starting now from the scratch. They're starting with the knowledge how to build already now an engine under gas mode,
Yeah.
big ones, and could use this kind of learning maybe for the next fuel. So on the end of the day, that should be not underestimated that you sharing knowledge, using it to promote this one, go the next step. And this is typical of engineering work that you're not starting from the scratch. You
Right.
look what I did yesterday, oh, and this one, and putting this together, and you are much faster than to come up with something. And I think in this regard, even inventing fuels, why not looking about what this kind of wind is be able to contribute? Because up to now, auch the other alternative fuels, what I mentioned, like methanol, ammonia, and LNG, are in this moment coming from fossil
Yeah.
production. So on the end of the day, we have to invent this one as a synthetic one. And there we got the indication that production on LNG, the synthetic one, it's the most easy one.
Right.
And then again, we could use the learning out of this one and going ahead. So in this regard, yeah, that is, it's all good. On the other hand, we are fully supporting in different direction, different ship owner. It is good that not all are running maybe the LNG way, that some are going even the other way, because only then you are be able to see if this is a better one, or is it equal, or is it worse, or where's it? If you not start this way, you never know if that was the right track or the wrong one.
And let's just change the discussion a little bit, because we've talked a lot about the technical side and some of the economic side. But do you think that there needs to be a greater political will from governments to shift this along, or do you think that the industry itself can solve the maritime carbon problem?
It is sometimes, look, if you see in Europe, I would say Europe could not say that they have performed in regard of vaccine as a best practice.
No.
There are other countries who have shown with a more practical approach that they are much faster than maybe the EU, for example. In this regard, we should not always push to the government only. Government should give a stable environment how you could make your planning. So you need regulations, you need timelines, you need targets. And I think this is the work of IMO, Paris Memorandum, and so on, that you have a target and say, this is our ambition. We would like to achieve this one. I think that is a part of political. And then they have to give a stable environment, for example, for companies to contribute. And this could be fuel producer that they know, okay, if I go in this direction, I could sell my product. And the next one is, and especially in the container shipping, if you're asking global liner, a lot of even believing on the customer.
Yeah.
As some are saying, we need a little bit more transparent visualization how this good has been shifted from A to B. And then you will see that shipping is already green, but that is not the meaning that we should not do more.
Yeah.
But if you see a total transportation, it's usually from the production place by truck or train up to the harbor. Then you make your deep sea shipping, and then you're arriving, and then you're going again on a train or truck, and then you have the local distribution, or somebody is going to the store by car for 20 kilometers, and maybe he's producing more CO2 by this 20 kilometers than the transportation of this maybe pair of Snickers have been generated. So a label, so that everyone is showing, okay, this was the contribution by shipping, this was the contribution by trucks, And then you have the lever arm to see where I have to do more effort to reduce the total emission. So on the end of the day, yes, we are believing in three aspects. Government, IMO needs to set targets and stable targets and not to change this every 2 years so that you have a certain planning. The industry is willing to order the vessels, and we are believing in this one that a lot of big owners are taking their responsibility.
Yeah.
And on the end of the day, the consumer as well. And you could hear nowadays more and more from liner companies in interviews, and I think you have done some as well, that they are saying, no, green shipping is not so expensive as you are believing. We could do it,
Yeah.
and it will not be a big burden for the final consumer. The most question is sometimes if everyone is be able to do it, and
The climate targets set by IMO are different to the climate targets being set by the Paris Agreement. Is that a problem for shipping?
if that is a problem, I guess the problem for shipping is if targets will be always modified.
Right.
If you're looking about, there was an agreement of an EEDI, then now an EEXI have been invented. Now a CII is coming. I think if you would ask a ship owner, and that is what we got in as feedback, they're saying we are willing to take our share, to take our burden even,
Yeah.
to contribute. But what we need is a certain stable timeline and a stable environment. And that is clear because you was talking about stranded asset. If somebody, for example, is building today a ship and following below IMO target line, and now somebody is coming over the timeline of 20 years of this vessel and changing it.
Yeah.
And you're coming then with a good planned vessel out of this kind of planning curve. I think then I do not want to use the word unfair, but how should be your planning if the target is a movable target? And they're shipping, I think ship owners are saying, whatever you are deciding, please make it for us stable to contribute and to make our planning around this one.
Right. So for DNV then, to decarbonize, you need to have realistic targets. You need to have a stable environment, and you need to have an engaged government and regulatory authorities.
Yes, everyone should take his responsibility and then really by sharing this one, and I think that is also the way of IMO, that each country is coming inside and the IMO is contributing this one. You're going back, you have some more larger nations who have a higher shipping, but then they bring back from the ship owner associations and so on this feedback inside in this kind of target setting. And in this regard, the largest target should be of all companies and all involved stakeholders. That means especially our government and IMO, let's find the right fuel.
Okay.
Because on the end of the day, we're talking here about always the same. We would like to move from A to B. And in this moment, maybe we are too stupid. We are always looking only on combustion engines. Maybe
Right.
somebody have a better idea. But in this moment, that is the most practical way. And that means if we're taking this as a fact, the immediately deleting of all problems was the right fuel. I think you will agree to this one. If you would,
Yeah.
and if I would find this fuel, then I would go in some years as a pensioner, rich person out. But I think this one, and I like in this regard the statement from the vaccine. If we would put now the same effort in environment to find a zero emission fuel, and not only CO2 free, it should be NOx free, it should be sulfur free, it should be as much as possible of particulate matter free. if we would find this one in a short time and be able to produce it in a quick scale, I think everyone would love it. And
excellent. I think that's a great place to stop. But thank you so much for your time. It's been very interesting talking to you, Jan Olaf Props, and I look forward to our next discussion.